This is the second instalment of a series of videos looking at the key A-level media theorists for the Eduqas specification. In this one, we'll take a look at Stuart Hall's stereotypes representation theory, Gauntlett's ideas on identity, Hesmondhalgh and risk, and Gerbner's cultivation theory. We'll start with Stuart Hall and representation. And this is a theory that is concerned with representations and stereotypes. First of all, Hall suggests that representation is the production of meaning through language, where language is a system of signs. I'm particularly interested in the third and fourth strand of this theory, that stereotyping as representation is reductive, that it is not complete. He doesn't say that stereotypes are untrue, but they reduce people to a limited number of characteristics, and that stereotyping occurs because of and in order to reinforce inequalities of power. And hopefully this will become clear when we start looking at the set text. So what Hall essentially says is that we use stereotypes to reduce people to a fraction of what they are as a whole, or a place, or an idea, in order that we can control it in our own vision, I suppose, so that people can maintain positions of power or continue to repress groups or individuals or places. So let's consider the WaterAid advert then in light of what Hall has to say. Here we have two of the opening shots, the opening shot at the top, and then we switch to Africa. We are immediately greeted with a stereotype of Britain. That is incomplete. It generalizes about Britain. It's the radio talking about the weather, sat inside on a rainy day. So it is critical of the things that we moan about. But it is also a stereotype that reinforces superiority. And Hall talks about this idea of stereotyping reinforcing inequalities of power. And this is very much what this video does in its stereotyping. Because we then cut to a shot of Africa, and it is a very, very stereotypical vision of Africa. Not that it is untrue, but that it is wholly incomplete. It is utterly reductive. And this is the way that charity adverts work. They repeat stereotypes of Africa as impoverished, as in need of the white saviour, saving by the white westernized European or American. And these stereotypes have been repeated and perpetuated over time in order to create Africa as this place of need. Now, the purpose and the overall goal is a moral one, in order to generate income and to generate donations. But we have to consider, and you have to consider as students, whether that overall that stereotyping is actually defeating the purpose. Because if we repeat this stereotype of Africa time and time again, that becomes the vision of Africa. And I have to confess, when I was growing up, I saw charity adverts over and over again. I saw the news stories from the Ethiopian famine of 1984. That, for a very long time, that was my vision of Africa as a continent. That is all I knew. Africa as a place of need, in need of rescue. But of course, that is a wholly incomplete vision of Africa, and that is what Hall argues. It reduces a whole place, an entire continent, down into a set of simple characteristics which come to define it. And that is done in order to maintain this inequality of power between the West and what we would have called the Third World. This continues throughout the advert. We see the extreme long shot of Claudia, and this is a barren landscape, a place of drought, a place of relative famine. And then we see the shots of women carrying buckets on their head, again, a stereotype of Africa that has come to define it, even though it is only a very, very narrow vision of Africa. We then see two men working the land, the use of primitive tools, again reinforcing this sense of otherness that is not necessarily untrue. It's not that these things aren't happening, it's that they are a very, very narrow vision. As I said, the goal of the adverts is a genuine moral one, but the representations are reductive in order to maintain that idea that Africa needs rescuing. And it's important that you consider whether that perpetuating of stereotype, even though it generates income, in the long run, is it destructive? Is it counterproductive? Stuart Hall, I think, would argue that it is. Some texts which might potentially support or challenge Hall's theory. So WaterAid certainly supports it. Tide, I think, Hall would argue, does, reinforcing stereotypes of women in order to sell products. Kiss of the Vampire is one which could be considered on both sides, because we do have certain images in that text which start to challenge stereotypes of femininity and masculinity, but on the whole both of the women are over-sexualized. And so they are reductive in lots of ways, and even the woman who's empowered is demonized in some way. And then the Sun and the Times in their representation of Theresa May, those representations are stereotypical and they reduce her to a very few characteristics. Texts which potentially challenge Hall's theory, Black Panther is one which is seeking to address that narrow stereotype of Africa through the construction of the fictional land of Wakanda. And Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation is certainly looking to broaden the stereotype of women within the gaming industry. We're next going to look at Gauntlett's ideas of identity, and there are some links between Gauntlett and Hall. Gauntlett's theory is very much one which sees the audience as an active audience. It's a progressive theory that understands that we no longer just passively receive messages in the media, but instead we use the media for our own purposes. And here he says that the media gives us the means to construct, validate, and legitimize our own identity, and that the modern media offers us a much more diverse range of identities in the past. If you are watching TV, for example, even only 30 years ago, there was a very, very limited range of channels for a start, and what that meant was that you had a very, very limited range of identities. Unless you were a straight, white, probably publicly school educated male, you didn't really get anyone on TV or there were very few people on TV who were going to reinforce your identity or give you an identity through which you might construct your own. And Gauntlett's argument is that the media, the modern media, gives us that much broader range of identities. So it doesn't matter whether you're white, what your ethnicity is, whether you're straight, homosexual, what your gender identity is. Gauntlett's argument is the modern media gives us those identities from which our own might be legitimized or validated. It's up to you as a student to decide the extent to which. I don't think there's any argument against that idea, that we do get a more diverse range, but it's the extent to which that range is diverse. Has it gone anywhere near far enough? My argument would be no. But that's up to you to evaluate that against a particular text, and that's what we'll have a brief look at now. So let's think about this idea of the identities of the past. Disney is a fantastic company to look at in terms of identity and representations. If we look at these Disney movies from the past, the representations of people of colour are wholly limited. There are exaggerated features on the top left. We then have that Jim Crow character who is now seen as particularly offensive from Dumbo. We have the Waziri tribe from Tarzan. Although they are positively presented, it's still very, very reductive. And then we have the faceless slaves again from Dumbo. So we have this very, very narrow range. If you're a black person watching Disney, you have an extremely narrow range of identities from which you might pick to reinforce your own, and that can be damaging. And that's why Black Panther is such a powerful text, and this very much supports, I think, Gauntlett's theory, because Black Panther is much more progressive. It's Marvel, but it's owned by Disney. And here we get a text which is about black empowerment, which is about ownership of identity. So if you are a black person watching this film, it gives you a range of identities to either aspire to or to reinforce your own ideology. Wakanda similarly broadens the representation of Africa. So if you are African, this is a much more progressive representation of Africa than we have been given in the past, and that might help to reinforce, construct, or validate your own identity. And then we're going to look at gaming. If we have a look at the representation of women over time, even where we got female heroic protagonists, we can see here that they were over-sexualized for the male gaze. And that is until very, very recently. And that is why Assassin's Creed is an important text, because finally we get a heroic female protagonist who is not defined by her body, who is not defined by the over-sexualization of her body. We get an identity, a female who is strong in her own right. When she dresses as a lady, it is by her own choice, and she uses that femininity as a tool of power. She is also a woman of mixed heritage, so we get that diversity of identity again. So Gauntlett would argue that this reinforces his idea that the modern media gives us a greater range of identities from which to construct our own. We're now going to have a look at Hesmondhalgh, and this follows on from the two texts that we've looked at. Hesmondhalgh's theory is largely about risk, and that's the main area we're going to look at. We'll have a look at all three strands here, but it's that top one that I particularly want to focus on here. The idea that cultural industry companies try to minimize risk and maximize audiences through vertical and horizontal integration and by formatting their cultural products. So the way in which companies produce and then distribute their products is done in a way that minimizes risk, and by minimizing risk they maximize audiences. Now that might seem like common sense, but it's up to us to look at these texts and consider the extent to which companies are minimizing risk. All companies want to minimize risk, because if you don't, you're going to lose money and you're going to lose audience. But it's the extent to which they are doing it that is important. He also says the idea that the largest companies or conglomerates now operate across a number of different cultural industries. Well, that's all part of this idea of minimizing risk. And his final one is the idea that the radical potential of the internet has been contained to some extent by its partial incorporation into a large profit-orientated set of cultural industries. That links with this idea of risk, because essentially he's saying the internet is now less risky, is less diverse, because it's owned by these large conglomerates, which are more focused on power and profit than they are on social and political ideology. So let's have a look at Black Panther again and consider the extent to which they are minimizing risk. Well, there is no question that Marvel do take some risks with this product. This is the first black heroic protagonist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They are therefore diverging from existing codes and conventions, and that is always slightly dangerous because your audience, your existing audience, has a set of expectations. And with this particular film, they are targeting a slightly different audience. There's an increasing focus on targeting Afro-American audiences here, and that worked because we can see from research that the audience share for African Americans doubled for this film from what we might expect for any other mainstream film. But there is no question that they were also looking to minimize risk and maximize profits. I have arguments with my students all the time about the limiting effects of Marvel as a company on the cinema. And lots of them are fans of Marvel and they disagree with me. But Marvel is a safe genre. It has a huge established audience. Therefore, it comes with a guaranteed success and profit. And this film made 1.34 billion, that should say dollars, not pounds, at the box office. They are employing existing codes and conventions, even though they change to a black heroic protagonist. We have a similar narrative arc. Most Marvel films have a very, very formulaic narrative arc and set character types. There is always the promise of the sequel. They are operating here across a number of industries. We have the film, but we also have the soundtrack by Kendrick Lamar. We have merchandise. So they're operating across a number of different platforms and industries in order to minimize risk. And we also have the formatting of the product with star appeal, the use of actors such as Michael B. Jordan and Martin Freeman. Household names which automatically guarantee audiences and therefore minimize risk. Similarly with Assassin's Creed, we're going to consider the extent to which Ubisoft, the developers of Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, have taken or minimized risk. So first of all, similarly to Black Panther, we have the first female protagonist in the Assassin's Creed franchise. They are once again therefore taking the risk of altering convention, which is changing the expectation of the audience. They're therefore diverging slightly away from the existing audience. We also get a single platform release just on the PS Vita. That in itself is risky because it limits your distribution model to a certain extent. But there are certainly lots of arguments that they are managing risk here too. Like with Marvel, this is one of the most successful franchises of all time. There is therefore already a huge existing audience. It is part of the chronology of the franchise too. It fits within the time periods of the franchise. Therefore, if you want to maintain the chronology, you have to buy the game. There is a simultaneous release with Assassin's Creed 3, and in their marketing, their distribution of Liberation, we get intertextual references to Connor Kenway and Assassin's Creed 3 in order to tap into that existing audience. Even though this is the first female protagonist, it is done in order to tap into a growing female audience. In 2012, 44% of gamers were female. That is much nearer to being 50-50 now. Liberation shares the same gameplay style and the same revenge narrative format as the other games in the franchise. And we're going to finish by having a look at George Gerbner's cultivation theory. Now, in opposition to Gauntlets, which is a theory about active audiences, Gerbner's is an older theory, and it's much more promoting this idea that audiences are passive, that we just receive the messages that the media gives us. Lots of these passive audience theories have been challenged and debunked, but it's important that we look at them still and think about the way audiences have changed. So Gerbner says that we are influenced ideologically by repeated patterns of representation over long periods of time. So that by viewing the same representations over and over again, that is what cultivates our own opinions and our own values. Now we can consider the texts we've looked at previously in this video for Gerbner's theory. If we think about gaming, the over-sexualization of women in games, Gerbner would argue that that influences our perception of women, that repeated representation. Within the film industry, within Disney in particular, Gerbner would argue that that repeated representation of Africa or people of colour over time cultivates our attitudes or our perception of a particular race of people or a particular place. The best text to look at in terms of cultivation theory is the newspaper industry, because there's no question that newspapers are trying to cultivate and reinforce and influence public opinion and ideology, and it all comes down to political ideology. This is a perfect example from the Daily Express, and probably the most right-wing of the mainstream newspapers, tabloids, and we can see their representation of migrants and immigrants over time as damaging, as dangerous. There's lots of reference to them flooding in. There are loads of other examples of there being immigrants being like a plague, of animalizing them. So we can see a very, very negative representation of immigrants over time and migrants over time. And Gerbner would argue that if you are a reader, an avid reader of the Daily Express, then that becomes your opinion of migrants. It's important to consider, though, whether the Daily Express creates that opinion in its reader or whether it reinforces that. Do we become right-wing because we read a right-wing newspaper, or do we read a right-wing newspaper because it reinforces our right-wing ideology? And the same applies on the left. And it's perhaps a mix of the two. Perhaps we become more liberal or more left-wing if we read a left-wing newspaper. Perhaps we become more right-wing if we read a right-wing newspaper. So that's really what Gerbner argues. And we can see it with individuals too. If we have a look at the Daily Mirror here, a left-wing publication, therefore anti-conservative, and we can see a representation of Theresa May over time as chaotic, as out of control, as weak, as undermined. And does that reinforce its audience's existing opinion about Theresa May? Does it cultivate it? Does it make it grow? Does it reinforce it? And so we can also see how different newspapers do it. We have the Daily Mail here, a right-wing newspaper, and the Daily Mirror, a left-wing newspaper, using the same intertextual reference to Margaret Thatcher, her famous quote, "This lady's not for turning," in an entirely different way to cultivate the ideology of its audience, whether that be a left-wing audience for the Daily Mirror or a right-wing audience for the Daily Mail. And so by the time we get to our set text here from the Daily Mirror, Gerbner would argue that the audience, the Daily Mirror, has cultivated in its audience a perception of Theresa May as being chaotic, as being out of control, as being inappropriate as Prime Minister. And therefore this front cover, which undermines her, which belittles her, merely reinforces that perception and helps it to grow and to develop. I hope that's been a helpful look at those four theorists. It's important that you consider those texts for yourself in light of that discussion, and to go away and see how you might apply those four theorists to your other set texts for Component 1, Sections A and B.